You went to Iowa in 1992, right? Is that right?
About then, yeah.
When did you actually write the memoir, or when did you start writing the memoir?
Yeah, that's another good question. Talk about slow. I started writing, I didn't read any of those segments today, but the book is also peppered with a number of different journal entries that gave me a lot of freedom in terms of how I could write the book. But I started taking, I didn't know I was going to write a book about the schoolhouse. I was living there and I just started taking all these notes. And I got one of those speckled Mead, school books that seemed right for that place. Composition books, exactly. And so I started taking notes, and journaling about it. And then at a certain point in time, I realized that some of the losses that I was going through were maybe not just my own belly button lint, that they might be able to speak to somebody else as well. That there was something communal. We all go through having to get over losses or abandonments or disorientations, whatever you want to call the things that we humanly go through. So I had started the book then. And I thought I'd had a decent draft of it by the end of the 90s, and then I realized that I didn't. And then it sat on the shelf for a long time, 15 years maybe, even as much as that point. I was thinking, okay, well maybe this isn't a book I published, maybe this is just my own, my own thing. This doesn't necessarily have to be shared out in the world. But again, I think I still wasn't vulnerable enough then. There's a part of the book I couldn't write. I couldn't write the Sybil part of the book yet. Still. Years after we stopped seeing each other, I still couldn't. There were drafts and years of this where it was just S. I couldn't even write her name. So I figured, okay, I'm not there yet. And I didn't really think I would publish a book. And then a couple of things sort of happened. The schoolhouse itself was razed, so the building was taken down. About 5-6 years ago, I think. And then that's when I started to feel an accountability that maybe I need to share this with other people, that this is something people won't know. The land is still there. The land is marvelous. It's a public state park at this point that you can have access to. But I was thinking, I had that schoolhouse. How do other people should have that. So that was one thing. The other thing I think also related to this thing we were talking about with phones, I started also to recognize that, your generation hasn't had a life without internet or cell phones or things of that nature. And it suddenly occurred to me that the whole opportunity to try and isolate yourself and get out of contact was really hard today. It's very hard to do that in the way the world operates. And so I realized it's only 20 years or so ago, but it's like this feels archival on some level, almost as distant as, Thoreau and Walden on some level in terms of the acceleration of how the changes are happening. And so in that sense, I started to say, well, maybe this is something that would be interesting for a current readership. And at base, it's a coming of age, story also. So I mean, it's actually speaking to a lot of people on that level, apart from whether or not they can imagine living without, Wi-Fi. So the book it was a long process. So it was about, I would say, 20-25 years in the making. This book, I didn't rush it, put it that way, and I had to grow into it in a way and to be able to write the parts that I think. I could still look in parts of this and still feel that there's some, I don't know if I would call it withholding, but some components that I don't know if I got there, but I do feel, put it this way, the weirdest part about going out and putting out a memoir that's sort of an older self is I read this now and I don't even recognize this person. And that feels actually good, It's like, but he's just filled with things I would no longer do, and I hope that means I've evolved a little at least. Yeah, follow up.
So how did you draw on your past to bring it into the story? In other words, was it just the journaling that you went back to, or was there any other way of digging into your...
Yeah, good. Well, like I said, in the 90s, I think to some extent, the book was more or less written. There was certain sections that had to really be dealt with that weren't. So a number of the parts of it were in place already in certain respects. But I did obviously have to go back, and the journals were somewhat, but actually more functional for me were photographs. I was taking huge amounts of documentation of photographs there when I lived there, and that helped me get back. You know, and I would go back and visit the land to some extent also and try and feel the physicality of it. But, you know, knock wood, I think the parts about it that were set back there were felt somewhat immediate still. I had a friend call me recently, and he was saying, he says, it doesn't feel very nostalgic. He says, the read doesn't feel like it's a nostalgic read. And I was like, well, that's good to hear. You know, that was good for me to hear, and that it did feel somewhat immediate. But I did have to, some of the change I mentioned earlier about the structure of the piece, one of the things I did have to change, you know, I had to come up with more or less a prologue. So why are you now, you know, in your 50s writing about this now? I sort of had to justify that to an extent. And so there were some changes I needed to make to put it up to date, but it still more or less held its form. I added a chapter, I broke another one into two, you know, some changes that happened. But overall I didn't have to access too much. It's still pretty, I mean, a lot of that is really fresh. I mean, you know, you start living in a landscape and paying that much attention to it. Now, I didn't talk about it as much in this reading. Within the book, you get into a lot of, the majority of the book is me walking around in the woods and learning things. And that stuff stays fresh, and that, you know, like this time of year, right? There's parts of me that are going, I got to start watching out to see whether the morels are coming. You know, the mushrooms are coming up. You know, and that's something I learned there, and it's sort of in my biological clock from 2 decades ago still. So, and that's true about, you asked about cattle. Yeah, after this, I moved up to Minnesota. I followed Beth, and that's where she was living, and I started living, actually while I was still in Iowa. After I left the schoolhouse, I lived on a farm in Iowa, maybe instead of 20 miles west, it was about 10 miles north of Iowa City, and I started taking care of cattle there. Didn't know what the hell I was doing. I should have written a whole other book about that, but not a one died on me. I ended up, that's a whole other, bringing in a calf that was born in February, and in my living room, with a hair dryer trying to save this calf, but not a one died on me. And then I moved up to Minnesota, and I ended up living on a cattle farm there. And it was just the way, and those reasons were just, I was trying to find ways to live with low overhead. I mean, some of you I know are emerging writers, and the big thing, I'm trying to remember, I think it was Eudora Welty had mentioned that, some of the, keep a low overhead. If you learn that, it's not like how do I make more money, it's sort of how do I lower my overhead, because what you need is time when you write. And time-money equation is a hard one to work out. But if you figure out, well, I don't think I'm giving away, at one point in time I lost water at the schoolhouse. And my landlady was like, well, I guess, you got to move. Because she couldn't fix it. It was a bigger issue with a well. And I was like, well, I don't want to move. And she said, well, I can't conscionably charge you rent without water. And I was like, okay. And then it was sort of like, that's when the click went in my head. It was suddenly like, oh, I don't have to come up with this much money this month. That means I don't have to do that dumb job. And now I have this much more. And it totally opened up the world for me for many years. That's why I was on a farm up in Minnesota as well. I was doing cattle chores as a way to lower the rent. And it just opened up the door of okay, now I have more time. So that's some of the cattle stuff maybe.